Well, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome to Grace. I want to begin our lesson today by recalling the major issues that I mentioned in our previous session. And these are issues that have to do with who God is, His repossession plan, His name, as we called it, would be issue number one. So God's name is a crucial thing that He wants us to understand, and it's sitting right back here in the book of Genesis. We begin to learn about His name in the book of Genesis, and that name is about His capacity, what He has the ability to do, the things that are resonant within the things that make up who God is. And so His capacity, His land, He's repossessing His land, and of course Satan's declaration was to usurp His name and His land and gain the glory for himself. So Satan would like to retain dominion over the earthly realm. He'd like to avoid the destruction that God said would come upon him through the seed of the woman. And he would like that glorification from mankind that belongs only to the Most High God. So we have God's name and God's land, and we're going to continually, throughout our study, journey through the Bible, we'll be seeing God put His capacity into play on behalf of man. In light of man's failure, man's incapacity and unrighteousness. He'll be showing that over and over so that we understand man's need of God to be for us what we can never be for ourselves or for God, for that matter. So God's going to do something with man. He'll be responsible for doing it. He'll make it happen. It's not something that He's looking for us to give Him assistance in. And these are the things that He's showing us as we work through the Bible. So even when we come to Paul's epistles, by the way, we're going to see the same thing apply. God's name has been put into effect for us, and we're going to see man's failure today. Paul's going to hold it up before us. So no matter the dispensation, it's always about who God is, who man is not, and therefore man's great need for God to be for man what man cannot be for himself. All right. The land, that's a most vital issue when it comes to what God's doing concerning the earthly realm. And the nation, the specific nation God chose to inherit that land. Our understanding, of course, that those things have nothing to do with believers of this dispensation. The land is not for us, in spite of all that we may have heard in by the way of our religious upbringings, or the religious songs that church folk oftentimes sing. The saved of this dispensation have never been promised the land that was promised to Abram and to Abram's seed. Again, those things are for believing Israel of time past and will be true for believing Israel of time future. So we're not looking for a city of gold, nor are we to expect streets paved with gold, and we see that all the time or hear about it. We're not awaiting the deed to a mansion that sits just over the hilltop. We're not crossing the river or marching to Zion. I know the songwriters, we call it hymnology. It's not theology, but hymnology. Israel crossed the river Jordan, but we'll not even gather at the river, and we've sung that probably many times in our days of religianity. The Holy Spirit indwells believers today, so we needn't request that He rain down on us today, as another hymn writer suggests. The point is simply this: as we conduct our journey through the Bible, we need to understand that all the things we're reading about, right here in the book of Genesis, and in the majority of the books to follow, are directly related to God's repossession plan for the earthly realm. Therefore, they have direct application to the nation that God promised to give the land, to which Abram was sent. Now, they have direct application to Israel of time past and to Israel of time future, not the Jews that are in the world today. Today, this dispensation of grace, God is not recognizing national distinctions, so everyone has to come the same way today and through that message that Paul delivered. However, we can learn much. We can go back, and we should go back. We are to go back to that program. To learn that program, we can learn about God's name by going back to His program with Israel. And we can learn about man's great need and about God's plan for the earth as we look back in time and we study God's word concerning what we call His earthly repossession plan. So when we come to the portion of God's word that deals directly with the present dispensation and believers today, we're going to find that while many things differ in these two programs, there are some things that do not differ, and we need to understand those things. So contrary to popular religious belief, the land was never meant for you and for me. Our citizenship is where? In heaven, according to the apostle to whom the dispensation of grace and a special Gentile ministry were committed, the Apostle Paul. So Hear those four issues again. Make sure that you have them firmly established in your minds. We'll see them over and over and over. The recurring theme, we could say, in connection with God's earthly kingdom program. His name, His land, God's nation, and the problem, the overriding problem of man, should say the continuing problem of man in our failure to measure up to who God is, and therefore our need to have Him put His name into effect for us and to do so graciously. So we can expect to see Satan also at work throughout our study, giving it his all, we could say, to thwart God's earthly repossession plan through the establishment of his own kingdom on earth. Satan would love his own kingdom on this earth. Satan's desire is to be glorified as God, as we said. Therefore, Satan will be doing everything within his power to establish his own kingdom on the earth in that same territory where God had once ruled and reigned. And therefore, Satan in his desire thinks that he should be monarch over the earth. And in the process, he'll be doing all that he can to prevent the seed that God promised would come from Eve that would crush his head. Now let's get back to the issue of that land. And when we left off in our previous session, we noted how that on two different occasions, God promised that land. Twice, He promised that land that had once been His own dwelling place to Abram and to Abram's seed. In Genesis chapter 12, for instance, as Abram had come into Canaan, we read God's promise there in verse 7, chapter 12, verse 7. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. Now that's pretty cut and dried, isn't it? Pretty clear cut, we'd say. Right there it is on the table. This land's going to belong to your seed. So the promise of the land came in connection with God's promise to make of Abram a great nation. We saw that earlier on there in that same passage in chapter 12. So obviously, if God meant what He said, and if God had the capacity to bring about what He promised, Abram could expect some offspring. We then moved from Genesis 12 into Genesis chapter 13. And we watched God reiterate His previous promise to the man named Abram, as though he hadn't made it to begin with. He's repeating it to Abram. So you think Abram had a problem with really believing that God meant what He said at the outset. As Abram is looking over the land that God promised to give him in Genesis 12, he was told to look over that land. He's scanning the land. God restates the promise He'd already made. In Genesis 13:15 we read, For all the land which thou seest, to thee, Abram, will I give it, and to thy seed for how long? Forever. So this is an everlasting possession promised to Abram. He then had Abram walk the length of it and the breadth of it so that Abram could grasp the scope of this property that God's giving to his seed. Obviously, this plan would play an integral role in God's plan to repossess the earthly realm. There's a verse, there in verse 15, for instance, God said, all the land that you see. So not a part of it, not a good portion of it, not bits and pieces here and there of the land, but the entire land, all this real estate belongs to you. And as far as the nation He would make of Abram, God said, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. You recall that passage. All the land and a multiplied seed to possess that property was something that Abraham could expect because God would do it. He could depend upon it if God was truthful about it and God didn't put any conditions on it. Well, Abram's multiplied seed would get the land. So the promise was given twice now. Then we came to Genesis chapter 15, working our way through that first book. And we saw God, in spite of Abram's failure in Egypt, when it came to Sarai and his deception there, God promised a third time to give to Abram and to his seed the land. So He's holding up man's failure, his capacity. God's pretty definite about Abram's seed in this land. Here's God's third promise in Genesis 15:7. And He said unto them, I am the Lord. That's my name, that brought thee out of Ur the Chaldees. So He did it, God did it, to give thee this land to inherit it. God's definite about this. Now you'd think Abram would catch on by this point that God meant what He said. He stated it 3 times. But watch him become a bit inquisitive with God, as though he wonders if God is really capable of pulling off what He promised. In light of this third statement concerning the land and a multiplied seed that would come from Abram, he's questioning God. He has a question here in Genesis chapter 15, verse 8. And Abram said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it. What? Think about this. Whereby, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? As though God's word wasn't good enough for him. What a question to ask. In light of the fact that he'd just given Abram the victory over the combined forces of those 4 kings we talked about earlier on. Abram was able to rescue Lot with 318 men and do so as he was able to chase down and overcome the combined forces of 4 kings who'd plundered the entire territory earlier. So God is doing this for Abram. Melchizedek assured Abram it was God who had done it for Abram. And now he's saying, how shall I know that I'm going to get this land? Should Abram need further proof at this point? No. God's word should have been enough. Yet, here he is saying, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? In other words, is there a way that you can prove what you've just promised to me? We would almost expect God to say something along these lines. After all the things that we've been through, Abram, you should know me like I know you. If you don't know me by now, you will never, never, never know me. Well, God didn't do that. Just as God would tell us something about Abram's offspring down the road, what did he say about the Jews? The Jews require a sign. God was ready to provide Abram with a sign that he knew Abram would understand. And this sign should clinch things in Abram's mind. God would ratify, we might say, certify, however you'd want to think about that. God would guarantee the covenant that he made with Abram back in Genesis chapter 12. The promise he made in 13, now in 15. He would do so through what came to be known as the blood path rite, or the blood path ceremony, a ritual that was common in Abram's day and in that part of the world, still common in some parts of the world today, by the way. This is how it was done. When 2 people were entering into a covenant, they would cut certain animals in half. And they would place a half of each carcass on either side of a path, so that the blood from the carcasses on both sides would come together, mingle together, and of those slain animals that were on each side. This is why it came to be called the blood path, or later on the blood trail. Once the fresh carcasses were appropriately placed, the covenant participants would then join hands, or one would walk behind the other, as both would proceed through the trail of blood between the carcasses. For what purpose, you might say? That sounds pretty gory, doesn't it? But interestingly enough, the word covenant in Genesis 15 is the Hebrew word berith, which means a cutting, according to the dictionary of the Hebrew. Why this gruesome ritual, we might ask? Well, it was meant to picture something very important to the covenant occupants. By walking through the trail of blood, both participants were agreeing that should either one break this covenant, break the vow they were making, the guilty party should expect to suffer the same fate as the slain animals that had been part of that covenant, that ritual. Do we find mention of this ceremony elsewhere in Scripture? Yes, we do. Let me show it to you. Notice this 6-verse passage in the book of Jeremiah, who was one of Israel's prophets. Now, I'll set the stage here, and then when we come to that passage, we'll know exactly what's happening. If a Hebrew fell on hard times, he could sell himself to another Hebrew for a certain amount of money, requiring him to work for a specific period of time. So he was selling himself as an indentured slave. However, the Hebrew folks were told that if they purchased another Hebrew, they were to release that indentured slave after 6 years of servitude. Don't make it last longer than 6. When he serves 6 years, it's over. Release that person. Apparently, these Hebrew folks here had made a covenant with God to do that very thing. They would honor that requirement. So let's follow the narrative, beginning with Jeremiah chapter 34 in the second half of verse 15. Here it sits, Jeremiah 34, second half of verse 15. And ye were now turned and had done right in my sight. I guess the whole verse is here. So they had done the right thing. They were doing that very thing, releasing those indentured servants after 6 years, in proclaiming liberty, every man to his neighbor. And ye had made a covenant before me in the house, which is called by my name. These Hebrew masters had begun doing what they'd promised God they would do, but they didn't continue to keep their promise. Notice verse 16. But ye turned and polluted my name, and caused every man his servant, and every man his handmaid, whom ye had set at liberty at their pleasure, to return, and brought them back into subjection, is the idea there, to be unto you for servants and for handmaids. So they had released them. Now they're bringing them back and making them serve for a longer period of time. Many of these folks had entered into a covenant with God, as he said here, vowing to release their Hebrew kinsmen who had sold themselves into service and who had served 6 years. Now they're breaking their vow to God by reclaiming those whose terms had expired, and they're forcing them back into servitude. What was the result of these folks breaching the covenant that they'd made? Well, verse 18 continues. And I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which have not performed the words of the covenant which they had made before me. Now catch this. When they cut the calf in twain and passed between the parts thereof. That's the blood trail ritual, the blood path covenant. They're sitting right there. Jeremiah is referencing it. Look at verse 19. The princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests and all the people of Israel, which passed between the parts of the calf. So this was done in the place where they were serving, or where they were worshiping God. Verse 20, I will even give them into the hand of their enemies. This was the result of breaking their covenant. And into the hand of them that seek their life, and their dead bodies. Do you see the fate? Because they had made that covenant and vowed that what happened to those animals would happen to them if they broke it, and now they're breaking it. Now we can see why in the ritual coming up, Abram's going to be filled with fear when he has to walk between his path with the covenant God's making with him. So their dead bodies shall be for meat unto the fowls of the heaven and to the beasts of the earth. So the idea was, if you break the covenant, you're to die. You're to suffer the fate of these slain animals. Not only that, the fowls of the heaven are going to come down and eat your carcasses. The blood path covenant was serious business back in that day, and still is, as I said, in some parts of the world today. There wasn't any provision in the blood path covenant to break the covenant vow and avoid the penalty the blood trail called for. The fate of the slain animals was to be the fate of the covenant breaker. The fowls of the heaven would be given to feast on the dead carcasses of the covenant breakers. And that's what Jeremiah is speaking of there in Jeremiah. So, by the way, we said this is practiced in connection, in some parts of the world, it's practiced in connection with arranged marriages in the Middle East. In the desert communities, I'm told even today, still being practiced in isolated parts of Egypt. According to historian Dr. Ray Vanderlaan, if I'm pronouncing it the right way. He describes in detail how the bride's father was to provide the animal and cut it in half, as Abram did in Genesis 15. The groom's father, known as the greater party in these wedding rituals, walks through first, actually stomping barefoot through that blood trail, promising that his son will be an honorable husband. And if not, he expects to be treated just like the animal whose blood was shed. The bride's father then performs the same rite. First the groom's father, then the bride's father, promising that his daughter is a virgin and that she will make a proper wife. And if she doesn't, if that part of the covenant is broken, you may do this to me, is what the bride's father was actually saying, and the groom's father, as they both stomp through that blood trail. In some Bedouin cultures today, if a man turns out to be a lousy husband, if he's abusive or dishonest or lazy, they don't find him dead. They find his father at the bottom of a pit with his throat slit and footprints in his blood. So this was serious business back in Abram's day. It's serious business today in some parts of the world. You wouldn't want to break a blood path covenant. Serious business. The penalty for violating the covenant? Death. When we come back to God's promise to give Abram and his seed the land, God was ready to ratify that covenant promise to Abram through this same ceremonial picture with which Abram would have been familiar in his day. The blood path promise, we might call it. Let's jump back to Genesis chapter 15. We'll watch the ceremony as it begins to unfold. God had made a promise to Abram twice concerning the land and a multiplied seed from Abram to possess that land. Plus, he's given Abram victory over the combined forces, as we said earlier, of those four armies of the four kings. And Abram's still questioning him. So God's going to give Abram more than what Abram bargained for. He's going to give him a sign that he won't forget. Let's watch the blood path ceremony as it begins to take shape here. Genesis 15, verse 9, and he, the Most High God, said unto Abram, take me an heifer of 3 years old, Abram, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram does precisely as he's told, and he knows what to do. Genesis 5:10, or 15:10 rather, and Abram took unto him all these, and he divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not. Verse 11, and when the fowls came down upon the carcasses to eat those animals, Abram drove them away. Why? No one's broken this covenant. And don't let this picture that's already broken, because no one's broken this covenant. So, birds, get away from here. What would the fowls represent in verse 11? If we look at picture and type, the idea there is what we might call, to the victor belongs the spoils. Should this covenant not be kept, it would be the fowls of the air that would stand to benefit from the one who broke this promise. Now, if the promise was to give Abram the land, who would get that land if Abram broke his side of the covenant? Was he given a side of the covenant to keep? Yes, he was. We'll see that. But who would get the land? Who would the fowls picture then? The enemy that was already occupying the land. They would win out. What a great picture of Satan's occupiers of the land that God was giving to Abram through the ceremonial ritual. If this covenant is broken, Israel's enemies get the land. Well, God's ready to ratify this covenant. So what does Abram do? He drives those fowls away. Why, he had done that when it came to the 4 kings. Had he not, he had chased them out of the country and took back possession of his nephew Lot. So let's jump ahead to verse 17. Watch me carefully as I read this verse, Genesis 15:17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, Abram, along with a smoking furnace and a burning lamp, passed between those pieces. Did I read it correctly? When it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, I don't see Abram's name anywhere here. A smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between those pieces. So did Abram pass between the cut up carcasses? Nope, he did not. Where was Abram? He was fast asleep. According to verse 12, God had given Abram what we might call a spiritual sedative, in a sense, so that God could walk that blood path all by himself, and Abram would not be participating. Rather than allowing Abram to walk through with God, a smoking furnace moves through the path. God is represented by a smoking furnace, and then a burning lamp passes between those pieces. So you've got 2 things going between the pieces. In the meantime, Abram's gone night-night. He's not watching this. He's not participating in this. He's asleep. What do you suppose the smoking furnace and the burning lamp represented? Because they're pictures of something here that we can look to Scripture and we can figure out precisely what they were meant to represent. We have several, in fact, scriptural references to use as a guide to determine the meaning of the picture. A vivid picture of the smoking furnace appears in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 20. Let's take a quick look. But the Lord hath taken you, speaking of Israel here, and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance as ye are this day. What was taking place in Egypt? Affliction. Israel was afflicted in Egypt. So here he's saying, the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of that affliction, out of that iron furnace, even out of Egypt. So the smoking furnace represents the affliction that God would allow to come upon the nation before they would get their land. And he's telling them way back here, through that, by that smoking furnace passing through the covenant, there's going to be some affliction come upon the people here. How about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as my cousin used to say, shake your bed, make your bed, and into bed we go. How about them? Were they not afflicted in? What were they afflicted in? A fiery furnace. It was a test, a trial. Of course, God delivered them. The fiery furnace, or the burning furnace that passed through the blood trail, pictured the affliction that those who were given the land would suffer when their part of that covenant was broken. Now, I want you to notice how beautifully this corresponds with what God told Abram just before Abram's blood path sedative began to take effect. Genesis 15:13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Here's the affliction. And shall serve them. This is back in Genesis 15 again. And they, speaking of Israel's Egyptian captivity, those who would afflict Israel, shall do what? Next two words. Afflict them 400 years. So this is a clear reference to the nation that God would make of Abram, the nation Israel, and the affliction pictured by the smoking furnace associated with the covenant God was making with Abram in Genesis chapter 15, the blood path promise concerning that land. Israel's affliction would precede their deliverance. How do we know that deliverance comes after the affliction? Well, the reason God allowed the Israel-Egyptian captivity in the first place was so that he could teach Israel something about himself through it and his ability to deliver them through that affliction. And he's teaching them that before they ever enter their promised land. How about the burning lamp part of the blood path ceremony? Well, there's a passage that we can look to help define what that picture represented. Here it is in Isaiah 62:1. For Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation, the deliverance of Israel, therefore, as a lamp that burneth. So there's deliverance. It's plain to see in this passage that the burning lamp represents God's deliverance of the nation he would make of Abram. So there we have it. The smoking furnace represented the nation's affliction, and the burning lamp represented the nation's deliverance, God's ability. The nation God would make of Abram, and the deliverance God was vowing he would provide for that nation. He's actually giving Abram here, a picture of his capacity, who he is, the things that are resonant in all those compound names of God. Jehovah this, Jehovah that, Jehovah Yireh, Jehovah Nissi, all those compound names. He's showing Abram way back here, there's a lot of capacity resident in my name and who I am. You can trust in me. You can depend upon me and rely upon me. You can put your faith in me to put who I am into effect for you, and I'll do it graciously. So the Most High God would be involved in both Israel's afflictions and her deliverance. And this covenant picture that's given back here, the blood trail ceremony, is meant to show this. God wouldn't need Israel's assistance to pull off his promise. He doesn't need their help because they won't have any capacity. He's showing that over and over again. What was Abram doing? He was sleeping soundly. Well, God was the only participant in the covenant he was making with Abram that day. Some would think and probably say that he was so alarmed at the thought that he would dreadful thought that he was going to have to walk through that path and then maintain for God what God was going to ask him to maintain, that he was horrified. A dark sleep, darkness came over him, and he was horrified by the thought of walking through that. And who knows if that caused him to lose enough energy that he fell asleep. But whatever it was, Abram slept as God did this all by himself. God would allow for the nation's afflictions, and God would provide the nation's deliverance, and all for the purpose of proving to that nation that he was going to make of Abram something about his name, his Jehovahness, and his grace, his capacity to act on Israel's behalf in light of their incessant failure, their unrighteous situation. And they would be totally incapable of doing anything for God. So Israel would need for God to make them into what he would need for them to be for him. And God would have to do it. They couldn't do it. Well, God was promising to do that very thing here in Genesis chapter 15 by passing through the blood path, the blood trail, all by himself and letting Abraham just snore away there. Notice verse 18 as we continue in this passage. Genesis 15:18. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land. Now we have the dimensions. Now we have the territorial boundaries marked off. From the river of Egypt, we saw that, didn't we, earlier on, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So there we see the dimensions of the land. From the river of Egypt, that would be the Nile, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. This is the same territory that God told Abram to walk the length of it and the breadth of it. Who would God have to remove from the land in order to for Abram's seed to fully possess that land? He'd have to expel those who were occupying it, those who Satan wanted to occupy it, so that Satan could maintain his monarchy over that property. They were not God's people. Who were they? Well, let's just read through Genesis 15:19, and we'll get an idea. The Kenizzites and the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites, not parasites, but I imagine the Perizzites were parasites, and the Rephaims. What's that word mean? Giants. And the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. God's going to have to remove these people for Israel to get that land that God's just promised Abram and his seed. Talk about repossession and a great repossession plan. Should the clans from Ham, mentioned here, accept God's people and turn to the Most High God through that nation that he would make of Abram, things would go well with those clans. These are people from Ham and some from Shem. Should they not accept the God of Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and should they turn Israel's hearts away from the Most High God who had given Abram the land in the first place, God would destroy those nations. God was swearing all by himself through the blood path ceremony we're seeing in Genesis 15 that he would do for Israel and be for Israel what they would have no capacity to do and be when it came to God's plan to repossess the land. Abram could count on this. This was God's unconditional agreement or promise with Abram. The author of the letter of Hebrews stated it this way in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. For when God made a promise to Abraham here, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I'm going to multiply you. And he swore by himself. Abram was sleeping, and he made that on his own life. Now let's think about that. Don't lose sight of the fact that God was the only one participating in the blood trail ceremony that he was making with Abram there in Genesis chapter 15. Abram was sound asleep while God crossed the path alone. There's a wonderful picture sitting here that we need to mention it as we look at this. If the smoking furnace passed through the path or passed across that path first, Abram being asleep, and that smoking furnace represented Israel's affliction and part of what God would do to Israel in connection with her enemies, followed by the burning lamp, picturing Israel's deliverance, that passed through secondly, then God passed through the blood trail how many times? Twice, while Abram slept. Now do you see a picture here? Wasn't God supposed to pass through once, and Abram passed through once? But here we see God pass through twice. First for himself, he would keep the covenant vows, and he passed through a second time, if this picture is what's sitting here, for the nation that he would make of the man who was in a deep sleep while the covenant was being ratified. He passed through once for himself and once through for Abram. There would be no danger of God breaking his covenant. But remember, the one to break it, that would be Abram's seed, in a plural sense in this case, the nation Israel, would break it at the cost of their what? Their lives. That's what the blood path covenant was all about. Well, if the picture is sitting here that I sort of see here, God passed through that blood trail twice. The first time he passed through for himself. Should he break the covenant? And the second time he passed through for Israel. In other words, he was passing through in their place. Israel's failure would come at the cost of his life if they failed. Do we see a picture sitting there? Possibly. God knowingly and willingly passed through for Abram, who was sound asleep, picturing the deliverance that he knew the nation would make, that he would make of Abram would ultimately need. Israel's deliverance would come at God's expense. That's the picture that I see sitting there. Now, I don't know if God intended that to be a picture of Israel's redemption through the death of God's Son, but it's sure a good one if he did. I kind of see that picture. The fact that the seed, singular, to come from Eve, would die for the sins of all was a truth hidden in the mind of God to be testified in due time through the due time testifier, which we now know as the Apostle Paul. That seed that would come from the woman would die for the sins of the nation Israel. That was spoken by the mouth of her prophet Isaiah long before Paul came along. So Some of you will recall these words found in Isaiah 53:8. For he was cut off out of the land of the living. Picture of the blood path ceremony here. For the transgression of my people, that would be Israel, was he stricken. So that's why I think there's a picture there of God passing through twice, once for himself and once on Abram's behalf. Should Abram break the covenant? Should his people break the covenant? The fate that was promised would happen to God himself. To be cut off from the land of the living was the price to be paid by the person who broke the blood path covenant. God knew while he was ratifying his covenant with Abram what Abram's seed would do in connection with that covenant. They would break it. You might say, well, they weren't given anything to do in connection with this particular covenant. Oh, yes, they were. The covenant was an unconditional promise. To be sure, it was unconditional concerning Abram's seed, namely Israel and the land. There would be the seed of Abram getting that land, and it was going to happen. Nothing could prevent that. It was God's unconditional promise to give Abram's seed the land. God wasn't about to break that. Unconditional promise. But if you were part of Abram's offspring at that time, a Jew by heritage, we might say, and you wanted to be numbered with the people to whom God had promised that land, you had to be circumcised as a sign that you were indeed a part of God's covenant people. Watch what God tells Abram in Genesis chapter 17. We're moving through here. We'll quickly read from verses 2 through verse 14. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, Abram, and I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, or multiply thee exceedingly. He'd already promised him a multiplied seed. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant was with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Here's the multiplied seed, verses 5 and 6. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram. This is where his name is changed, from the father of a great nation to the father of many nations. But thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful. And I will make nations of thee. The fruitfulness here has to do with his ability when it comes to generating that population that's going to come forth from him. And kings shall come out of thee. Verse 7, And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee and their generations for an everlasting covenant to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. Verses 8 and 9, And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. Had he not already promised that twice and ratified it the third time? And now here it is in the fourth mention. And I will be their God. Now watch. And God said to Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant. Wait a minute, I thought God was doing it all by himself. He was. But if you wanted to be numbered with those people he would unconditionally give the land, now there's something here for them to do. Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou, Abram, and thy seed after thee and their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token, a picture, an example here of the covenant between me and you. What was the penalty for refusing circumcision if you were of Abram's lineage? Well, here it sits in Genesis 17:14. And the uncircumcised man-child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He's a Jew, yes. He's an Israeli, whatever you want to call him. This is what will come to pass as that nation becomes established. But that soul shall be cut off from among his people. So the physical lineage, the physical heritage wouldn't mean a thing. He would not be considered a member of the nation. He'd be cut off from the people. He hath broken my covenant. To be cut off from the people was to be cut off from the covenant God made with Abram concerning that land. The covenant God made with Abram was an unconditional covenant. God promised to Abram's seed the land as an everlasting possession. But if you were related to Abraham by heritage, and you refused the circumcision being spoken of here, you were not a legitimate part of the nation to be given that land. As far as God was concerned, circumcision was an absolute requirement if you wanted to be considered a covenant participant in God's program with Israel and his promise of the land to Abram. Now let's go back to chapter 16 for a few moments, to the time just before God instituted circumcision as a sign of the covenant he made with Abram. God promised Abram 3 times, as we demonstrated here, that he would make of him that great nation. He promised it in Genesis chapter 12. He promised it again in Genesis chapter 13. Then we watched as he ratified his promise to Abram in Genesis chapter 15. No less than 3 times God promised Abram a multiplied seed. And that Abram's seed, that multiplied seed, would inherit the land. This was certainly part of the capacity resident in God's name. God would accomplish it for that nation. Yet, as we said in our previous session, Sarai was barren. Now, in order to appreciate God's name and the need for God to put his name into action on behalf of his human creation and do so graciously, we can expect God to continue highlighting the incapacity of his fleshly nation, and therefore their need for God to implement his name, his capacity on their behalf, and do so graciously. We're seeing it with Abram and Sarai in Genesis chapter 16. God is showing us their failure and their need of his name. Abram was 85 years old. Sarai was 75 years old. Abram had been promised a multiplied seed. Could God actually pull that off? With Sarai's age, not to mention her barrenness, she reasoned that the only way God could fulfill his promise was for her to allow Abram to take her Egyptian handmaid Hagar to be his wife. So she suggests that very thing. She and Abram can help God fulfill his promise, because it's beyond their capacity physically to do so. So now they can help him fulfill that promise, and Sarai could have children, but not for Abram's sake, according to the scripture here. Notice the failure. She didn't do this to give Abram a seed because she knew Abram needed a seed. Watch her true motive show itself in verse 2 of chapter 16. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. Another failure of fleshly man sitting right there. Now it's God's fault that she's barren. You see the failure? The same God who had promised Abram a multiplied seed, the same God who had given Abram and his multiplied seed the land, now it's his fault that Sarai is barren. I pray thee, go into my maid, she requests of Abram. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Now, what's that old saying? If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. No jealousy in this marriage manipulation as they help God pull off this promise? Well, not yet. Of course, we don't see Abram raising a ruckus over Sarai's suggestion. He willingly and perhaps even quickly obliged his wife. Just as Adam had hearkened to the voice of Eve, here we see Abram doing the same thing. He was concurring with the carefully laid plan concocted by Sarai. Okay, I'll go along. Both Abram and Sarai were operating as though they had the capacity to bring about what God had already promised that he would bring to pass. Hold the horses. There's more to happen here. Those of you familiar with the story know that Hagar bore Ishmael. So Ishmael became Abram's firstborn son. The question commonly asked in our day could have been put to Sarai after Ishmael was born. How's that working for you, Sarai? Ishmael was born of man's plan to fulfill God's promise. Keep that in mind. Ishmael was born of man's plan to fulfill God's promise for him, to help God out. The same thing is happening today, only in a different context. There are a lot of religious folks out there who insist that they must help God when it comes to the issue of their being truly righteous in his sight. We're going to help him out because he can't make us righteous. He can't credit us with a righteousness that's not ours unless we perform. So they're helping God fulfill his promise to make them righteous. They believe they must help him keep his promise to give them everlasting life by way of their performance righteousness. Man's plan to fulfill God's promise comes in more than one flavor. So Sarai had a plan to help God fulfill his promise. We'll pull it off. We don't think God can pull it off, so we'll pull it off for him. So Abram and Sarai had been living in Canaan now for 10 years, and the promise God made to Abram of a multiplied seed had not come to pass. 10 years they're there, and it hadn't come to pass. Think about that for a moment. Abram was 75 years old when God called him out of Ur of the Chaldees and sent him to the land. He was 80 years old when God promised him a son. He was 85 years old, and Sarai was 75 years old when Sarai concocted her plan to help God fulfill his promise. it's evident that both were becoming a bit impatient when it came to God and what God had vowed to do as far as a multiplied seed for Abram was concerned. But is time a factor when it comes to God fulfilling a promise he's made? Would time limit God? Would time keep God from fulfilling a promise that God made that he would fulfill? The answer is no. In fact, one of the aspects of God's name is that he's timeless. Time doesn't stop a promise from being made when God makes that promise. Time's not a factor when it comes to God keeping his word. Time cannot hinder or halt the Most High God from following through on what he's promised to do. God was teaching that lesson to Abram and to Sarai. And this is wonderful doctrine for us today. It's God's name. How many do you suppose in our day are saying something along these lines? How many centuries have passed and he's still not caught us up to be with him in the air? Is the catching away of the church a reality, some might say? Or is it just a figment of religious man's imagination? People give up. Why? Because they suppose God's given up, because they don't see his promise. When God makes a promise, he keeps that promise, because God cannot lie. So he's teaching Abram, and we can learn by going back to the story. Time's not a factor with God. Don't consider 2,000 years anything with God. He'll keep his promise. Let's go back to Abram and Sarai for a moment here. What was the end result of their attempt to help God fulfill his promise? Certainly didn't end as Sarai expected it to end. The child Sarai thought would bring her ecstasy only proved to highlight her Adamic nature related envy. Sarai began to despise her handmaid Hagar. Jealousy, along with the joy of Hagar's life, which was Ishmael. So Sarai put both of them out on the street, we would say today. When the capacity resident in fleshly man is held up against the capacity resident in God's name, man's always proven to be the needy one. God is not in need of man. In grace, God chose to include man, we could say, in his master plan in order to show his desire to do for man what man would have no capacity to do for himself, much less for God. Man is in need of God. It's not the other way around. And God's proving that to us over and over again here in his book of beginnings as he relates the failure of all men, no matter the dispensation, the manner in which he deals with them. The common thread in all of these stories, folks, is God's capacity, man's incapacity. God's success, man's continual failure. Is God the one who planted the fleshly scheme in Sarai's mind? No. He already knew Sarai's heart better than Sarai had known her own heart. But God allowed Sarai's folly, we might call it, in order to demonstrate her need. And Abram's need of God, his great capacity to meet his need, to meet Abram's need through the exercise of his name. And the necessity that man would have for God to meet that need in a gracious manner, not because they deserved it. And God's love compels him to meet that need graciously. The conflict over the land in connection with God's earthly repossession plan had begun early on with Satan's attempts to use offspring of Ham to establish his own kingdom in the land. So we see all these ites sitting in that land. Ham's descendants were already there, according to Scripture, when Abram arrived. The Jews weren't there. Israel wasn't there. They hadn't been dwelling there, left there, and come back to there. And now the people that were there could complain, and Israel could say, we deserve that land. No, Ham's descendants were already there when Israel was first sent there. Abram was first sent there. So Ham's descendants were the rightful, not the rightful, the wrongful, because the land belonged to God. They were occupying that land that rightfully belonged to God. Now Abram and his seed are given the land, and Abram's firstborn son is Ishmael. Doesn't take a genius to figure out whose descendants will be staking their claim to that land, does it? Who's the firstborn of Abram? Ishmael. And what was Abram promised? That his seed would inherit the land. I think we can be reasonably sure that there's going to be a claim staked to that land by the descendants of Ishmael. The reason for their claim is because Ishmael was not only Abram's seed, he was also Abram's firstborn son, and the land was promised to Abram's seed. We'll get back to this issue in just a few moments, but we're seeing that conflict play itself out even in our day. The battle for that land today is between those who claim they're linked to Ishmael and those who claim that they are the nation Israel. And the battle's ongoing, even in our day. So let's consider Ishmael for a moment. Let's see if we can get into his mind. See if we can get a better grasp of what was going on in that young man's mind. As I said, Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. What's the difference between 86 and 100? This made Ishmael, if my math is correct, 14 years older than Isaac. We could assume that Ishmael would have been 16 or 17 when Sarai put him and his mother out of the house, because they weren't put out till Isaac was weaned. So if you figure maybe 2 years, you ladies know better than I, maybe 2 years or so, Abram's got to be 16 or 17. So don't read that passage in Genesis that Abram put the bread and the water on her shoulder along with Ishmael on her shoulder. She wasn't carrying a 16 or 17-year-old young man on her shoulder. He gave her the bread and water, and then he gave her Ishmael also to take with her on her journey as they're put out of the house. Now think about that. Consider his mindset. Ishmael had been the only child for a long time, folks. He would have most likely been the delight of everybody's eye in that family. From infancy to 14, it's a long time to be the sole focus of attention. Ishmael would have been the center of that family's world up to the time of Isaac's birth. Now a brand new bundling baby boy enters the scene, and this new attention-grabbing baby, Isaac, he's getting all the attention. And Isaac and Ishmael share a common father. Should Isaac be getting all the attention that Ishmael had been getting all his life up to this point? They didn't share a common mother, did they? Did Abram love his son Ishmael? Oh, dearly. The passage points that out. He loved him dearly. The passage bears that out if you read it. But there were two different mothers in that household. And clearly, Sarai favored her son Isaac. Could the jealousy between Sarah and Isaac, or Sarah and Hagar, I should say, could that have flavored Ishmael's view just a bit of this newborn baby boy? Might Ishmael have heard the two women arguing over those two boys? Ishmael's mother was Sarai's handmaid, so Sarai clearly held the upper hand, and Ishmael knew that, even though they shared a common father. Could Ishmael have possibly overheard them arguing over the rightful inheritance to Abram's fortunes? Do you see the mindset developing of this young man as he's growing up, and now he's got this new baby boy and sibling rivalries coming into the picture? Now the day of Isaac's weaning arrives, and Ishmael's dad, Abram, the dad they commonly share, is throwing a huge party. He's throwing a bash in celebration of this big event of Isaac's weaning. Can you see the jealousy fomenting in Ishmael's mind here? Why are they making such a big deal of this kid? The sin nature of man is manifesting itself over and over again, and God is showing us that in these stories. We're at the doorstep of Genesis chapter 21, verse 9, as the party thrown in Isaac's honor is about to begin. And Sarai saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which Hagar had borne to Abram, mocking. So now Ishmael's mocking this kid. Ishmael was filled with contempt for this youngster. He was wearing his disdain for Isaac on his shoulder by the time of this event. This was the jealousy we saw with Cain, was it not, when Cain slew Abel? The sibling rivalry there. God is continually showing us man's ongoing failure, his lack of righteousness. But Isaac here couldn't have been but more than about 2 years old. As you can imagine, you've got a 16 or 17-year-old ridiculing a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old belongs to which mother? Sarai. Is this mom going to get defensive? She going to jump into action on behalf of her little Isaac, who's too young to fend for himself? You bet she is. Verse 10, wherefore she said unto Abram, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son. Oh, now we get some other motivation in here. He shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abram's sight. Did he love Ishmael? You bet he did. Because of his son. Abram loved Isaac. He loved both sons, but he didn't have any less love for Isaac. Verse 12, and God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad. and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. Now catch this. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. So he's not going to leave. God is not going to leave Ishmael out here. You see where the contention over the land was centered in that day and remains centered in ours? The Arabs based their right to the land by claiming that all Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. A lot of those Arabs do. Why, Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, Abraham's firstborn son. Therefore, Ishmael's descendants are the rightful owners of that land. He was the firstborn. And that land includes the land that Israel is sitting on today. So Israel, get out. We don't want you here. You're nothing more than the occupiers of the land that rightfully belongs to us. We were here first. That's the cry from much of the Arabic world today. The Jews aren't the rightful owners of the land. They're simply the wrongful occupiers of the land. Their desire, Israel, scram. Get out. And wipe them off the face of the earth. Now, not all the Arabs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Arabs, although the vast majority of the Arabs are of the Islamic faith. So how about the Muslims of the world who are not Arabs? How do they have a right to that land? Why do they call Israel the little Satan and accuse them of wrongfully occupying that small piece of real estate that Israel has today? Unbelieving Israel at that. Why do they want the Jews out of that land altogether? Well, the Muslims claim their right to that land based on the fact that their prophet Muhammad, upon which the Islamic faith system is based, also claimed to be a descendant of, guess who? Ishmael. Can you see it? So it keeps coming back to the Isaac-Ishmael conflict, as we can see. But now, think about this for a moment. Were all the ites the Bible talks about referring to the descendants of Ham and Cush, not Ishmael, were all those ites not already in the land when Abram was sent there? And they weren't related to Ishmael. Sure they were. They were there long before the birth of Ishmael, or Abram for that matter. Of course, later on, the 12 sons of Ishmael intermarried with some of the Ite clans that were already in the land, and they became known as the Ishmaelites. They began to they began to assimilate into some of those clans. So understand, not every Arab in the land in Abram's day was related to Ishmael. They couldn't have been related to Ishmael because Ishmael wasn't around to be related to, and neither was his father. Add to that the fact that Isaac's son Esau and his descendants were in the land at that time as well. So even today, you have a mix over there. Some may indeed be related to Ishmael in their lineage, while others do not. Not every Arab is a descendant of Ishmael, although that was the claim of Islam's prophet Muhammad. In fact, Islam's claim to the land is based on Muhammad's claim to have a descendancy from Ishmael. Yet, interestingly enough, nowhere in the Quran does it state that Ishmael is the progenitor of the Arab race. Yet they believe it. Why? Tradition. So you can see that what began as a sibling rivalry turned into a religious rivalry as time went on. Now it's not thought of as a sibling rivalry at all. It's thought of as the Islam faith against Judaism. It's a rivalry in that sense. It's a contest between Islam and Judaism. Islam claims that the mosque on the temple site in Jerusalem stands where it does. Why? Because Muhammad visited Jerusalem and he stood in that very location. But did Muhammad actually go to Jerusalem? Well, according to the Quran, he did, but how? The Quran is the Bible of Islam, as you know. And according to the writings and sayings of their prophet Muhammad, called the Hadith, Muhammad had a dream in the middle of the night in which he traveled through the sky, visited 7 heavens, met great people like Jesus, just another prophet in their reasoning, and visited Jerusalem. How did he do it? In a dream. In a dream. Where did he stand in that dream? On the temple site. So that belongs to who? Islam. After all, Muhammad was a relative of Ishmael, and now that belongs to Islam. Since this was only a dream, Muhammad was never actually in Jerusalem in the first place. So when you boil it all down, all the Arab people are not the descendants of Ishmael, and all Muslims are not the descendants of Ishmael either. And even if they were, which they aren't, what difference would it really make? Ishmael was born of Abram and Sarai's attempt to fulfill God's promise for him. Ishmael was a child of the flesh rather than a child of the promise. Scripture tells us Isaac was the child of the promise, as Paul so clearly states in Romans chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Here it is. Neither because they are the seed of Abram, physically, are they all children. But in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, the seed of Abram by physical lineage only, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Now notice verse 9. For this is the word of promise. At this time will I come, and Sarah shall have a son. Who was Sarah's son? We all know the identity of Sarah's son. His name is Isaac. The land given to Abram would pass down to Abram's son Isaac. It would pass down from Isaac on down to Isaac's son Jacob, whose name would be changed to Israel, and then to the 12 sons of Jacob, which would become the 12 tribes of Israel. We know that Levi didn't get a right to the property, but Joseph's portion was divided in two, his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and we're back to 12. While Ishmael was a child of Abram by fleshly lineage only, Isaac was the child of promise. So it wouldn't make any difference if they were related to Ishmael or not, and it could prove their lineage to Ishmael. Ishmael wasn't given the land. Nowhere is Ishmael given the land. Did you know that? Isaac was the child of the covenant that God made with his father Abram. In God's earthly repossession plan, Israel would become the rightful owners of the land that had at one time been the location of God's throne room residency here on the earth. This is what we're seeing, folks, and we're seeing it way back here in the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis. Israel's rightful ownership of the land is sitting in Genesis chapter 17, verses 19 through 21. Now, we'll go through that in our next session. I see time's up, and I don't know how long it's been up. So, anyway, our time is out. We'll pick it up here in our next session when I return, but understand that Israel's the rightful occupiers of the land because it belonged to God. And he gave it to them, and it's their land. But it would be their land contingent upon some things Israel would have to do if they wanted to be considered a part of true Israel. And understand the Israel in that land today is unbelieving Israel. God has not started calling them back into the land. That won't take place until Christ's return, his second coming to the earth. Right now, that land is indeed being occupied by unbelieving Israel. And don't think that if they were to wipe the unbelieving Israel off the map today, that's going to stop God for a second when it comes to calling the true Israel back to that land, installing them in that land, and fulfilling his earthly repossession plan. It's going to come about just as God promised it would come about. So let's leave it there. We'll pick it up in our next session right where we left off today, and we'll carry it on as we continue to work our way through the Bible, watching God highlight his great capacity, all that's resident within his name, and setting that alongside man's tremendous incapacity, his lack of righteousness, his ongoing failure when it comes to do or be for God what God will have to do and be for man. We'll see this as we continue to work our way, continuing on in our journey through the Bible. Let's leave it there for today. Let's thank God for what the word that he's shown us today, and that he inspired to be written so that we could learn these things about who God is and who man is not.